I always tell clients it's really hard to make decisions if there isn't a foundational piece of knowing who you truly are. It doesn't mean you need to know everything because we're constantly evolving, we're constantly growing. But some people will want to make decisions, but they don't even know what they actually value. What is the compass that leads them? And it's really hard to make any decisions if you don't know some of those foundational pieces. And so if you're not making decisions from that steady foundation, your decision making is going to be like that GPS that's always saying recalibrating, reroute, because you're trying to decide also while you're actually changing. I hope that makes sense. So, no wonder it feels impossible, right? It's like asking someone mid metamorphosis to predict who they'll become. And so the transformation is still unfolding. And so remember all that advice I had listed in the beginning. And here's what they all have in common. They assume you're the same person who started this journey, but you're not, right? And that changes everything about how you approach decisions. Okay. And I'm going to share a little story about my own personal mishaps. But I'm a Libra, yes, and I take astrology with a grain of salt. But as a Libra, if any of my fellow Libras know, we're known to be indecisive, and I rebuke that now. And I just feel like we're careful with how we make our decisions, so we don't spend time on things that just is going to take up too much mental capacity. So we're like, I don't know, ask me something else, right? If you're a Libra and you understand this, let me know. But decisions weren't just hard for me in the past; they were actually pretty paralyzing. And again, I grew up in this household where having my own opinion wasn't just discouraged; it was actually dangerous for me to have that. So I never learned what psychologists will call self-efficacy, and it's just a fancy term that basically says the confidence that you can trust your own judgment and handle whatever life throws at you. So if you didn't develop that as a kid, you're always gonna be like second guessing yourself. You're always gonna maybe um, you're always gonna outsource your own wisdom to someone else. And so you can see how tricky it all can be and why it's so important to begin building that self trust muscle, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But anyway, so for years, I was that person who would stand in the cereal aisle for 20 minutes, paralyzed by which box to choose. I mean, granted, that's still kind of happening now. I'm still on that aisle once in a while, wondering or scrolling. I know, like me and my partner were ordering food. I'm just like scrolling on the DoorDash app or something like that, or whatever app we're using, trying to decide. So, I have to say it's still kind of there sometimes. But back in the day, like every decision used to feel like life or death for me because I had, again, no internal compass. I didn't know which voice was mine and which belonged to everyone else who'd ever had an opinion in my life, right? And the cost of that, I was living everyone else's life except my own, right? I was miserable, but at least I was safely miserable, you know? You know those folks, at least they're safe. I always say it's an illusion of safety. We're not, we feel like we're safe, but we're actually not, right? Um, and so it feels easier to stay in that safe bubble that we created for ourselves versus stepping outside of that because that just, we don't know what's out there. So we're safely miserable. Um, but then, along the way, something just kind of clicked, right? I realized that staying stuck was actually destroying me faster than any wrong decision ever could. And that paralysis was really the real killer. Let me know if that sounds familiar for you, where you're kind of at this point where, like, man, I just need to make this decision because if I stay in this place, it's actually going to just be that much more worse for me. So I started an experiment. Began to just kind of like force myself to make decisions, small ones at first, without having all the information. And, not all of them went my way, as so life does, and some worked out, and, most were kind of like in that middle space. But the thing that I discovered was that I actually could handle it all. And I feel like we're born with all the internal resources that we need. We just have to discover what those are. And the only way that we're going to discover what those are is by taking those risks, right? There's nothing anyone outside of us can give us. So I just want you to definitely keep that in mind. I see the chat moving. All right, Toya's saying that's where she's at. Thank you for sharing, Tora. But yeah, we can handle a lot more than we think. Some of us have probably handled too much, right? The one person that carries it all, just because we carry it all doesn't mean that it's not heavy. So there could be a bit of a complicated nature of that, uh, but we do have all the internal resources within us to get through some of these challenging moments. But, somewhere along the way, my voice got louder than all the others because I decided to just take those tiny risks. Sometimes they were bigger risks. Sometimes I'm somebody who is more of like the rip the band-aid off kind of person versus tip my toe in. So a lot of the decisions I did make were like, they're like totally upheavaled my whole entire life kind of decisions. But that kind of works for me. You have to find your own intensity rhythm, I say, because like some people have to work with whatever their nervous system can actually hold, right? So now when I'm facing a big choice, I don't ask what's the right answer or the best answer. I ask what would honor my truest self without all the fear and judgment. I have to move away from all the fear and judgment, but like how can I honor myself in this moment? And when you ask that question versus like what's the best answer, you get a lot more clarity and you feel more connected to whatever that decision might be, and you'll feel and see it a lot clearer than focusing on the decision itself. And for some folks who are still kind of like understanding themselves, it still might be a little bit cluttered. But when you continue to practice it, even in a smaller scale, which we're going to talk a little bit later, it does start to open up a little bit. Okay. Let me check the chat. I think it's um, moving. Afraid of making the wrong decision. Yeah. And that's a lot of people. Everyone's afraid of making the wrong decision. Um, but, decisions are just feedback. And so I always say it's better to get the feedback as quickly as you can because then you can make those adjustments. But if you don't ever get the feedback, you can't ever make those adjustments, right? And so sometimes we have to start small. We have to start where our nervous system is because sometimes if it feels too paralyzing, it'll just backfire on us and then we might retreat 20 steps versus one step. Okay. So quitting my job as a social worker with 3 months savings, buying a one-way ticket to start over, moving my son across state lines for better opportunities. Those aren't all perfect decisions, but they were my choices, right? And I had to deal with those consequences of those choices. And some consequences aren't bad consequences, some of them are positive, right? And so, again, there's no like negative, bad, good kind of thing, but uh, not every decision I made was perfect, but they gave me the feedback that I needed to figure out the next thing, then the next thing, and it just keeps going from there. And so, what I learned over time, again, there is no perfect decision, like that just doesn't exist, right? But there is such a thing as a decision that's true to who you are. And when you make those, everything becomes figure outable, as Marie Forleo would say. If you know Marie Forleo, she wrote a book called Figure Outable. And you can just figure everything out along the way, right?